Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's dive in. Welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, man never enters the same river twice. I seem to have entered a river where my Mac does not speak to that projector, and we have not been able to climb our way out of that river yet. So I am recording the remote lecture, the video lecture on my Mac. You are watching the local PC, and I am trying to remember to advance both slides. So if I say, as you can see on this slide, this neuron connects to this synapse, and you don't see that neuron in that synapse, just point at the screen or wave and remind me, and I will do my best to keep everything in sync. Okay, so before we get back to the nuts and bolts of evolutionary robotics, as I mentioned, it's a wide open field. There's lots of big discoveries still to be made in evolutionary robotics and robotics in general. A few years back, Sam Kriegman took this course. Sam became my PhD student and ended up on the CBS Evening News last Sunday night talking about xenobots. So hopefully some of you will be on national evening news in a few years from now talking about your evolutionary robotics discoveries. Okay. Until then, let's talk about artificial neural networks, evolutionary algorithms, and physical simulation, the nuts and bolts of the pieces you're going to need to make up your evolutionary robotics experiment, which you are in the process of doing. How many people have finished assignment 2? Joints are all done. Okay, so you know how to connect pairs of links together. Who feels comfortable now with absolute and relative coordinate frames? Some hands, some waving hands. Okay. Again, you got plenty of time now at the beginning of this semester. Hopefully, with the code base that you have at the moment, it should be relatively easy to tear down whatever robot body plan you have and make a new one. I would suggest practicing a little bit before your code base becomes larger and more intricate. So get familiar with links, joints, absolute, and relative coordinate frames. Okay. You're going to be moving on to assignment 3. You're going to be moving on to assignment 3 this week. And in assignment 3, you are going to be working on incorporating sensors into your robot. And as we talked about before, we're eventually working towards closed loop control. Your robot senses some physical phenomenon out there in the world. In your case, it's sensing phenomena in a virtual world. It's turning that sensation through a neural network into motor outputs. We were talking about neural networks last time. We'll finish our discussion about ANNs today. One way of viewing a neural network is it embodies an arbitrary function or transformation from the values arriving at the input layer into values that are going to the output layer. When we put our neural network inside the robot, the sensor values are being transformed into output values. And those output values are going to be interpreted as commands that are sent to the motors. And you're going to be incorporating motors into your robot next week. So 6 basic parts that are going to make up your robot: links, joints, sensors, motors, neurons, and synapses. Yep. Once we've got all those 6 pieces together, we're going to wrap it in an evolutionary algorithm, which is going to tinker with the values of those 6 components, seeking some combination of values, some combination of body and brain that gets your virtual robot to do something useful. We're going to talk today about evolutionary algorithms. Okay, just a couple of pointers about assignment 3. You're going to be implementing or importing 2 very popular Python libraries, and you're going to make extensive use of these 2 libraries as you continue on through this course. The first one is NumPy, that stands for Numerical Python. Anybody worked with NumPy before? Almost everybody. Great. You're going to be visualizing the sensor values arriving at your robot this week, and you're going to be using matplotlib, a visualization package in Python for visualizing sensor values. How many of you have worked with matplotlib before? Some, but not quite everybody. Okay, so if you have not come across these 2 packages before, again, I would suggest you carve out some time this week to just get familiar with these packages and what they can do. We're going to make extensive use of them as we go. Okay, any other questions about assignment 3, assignment 2, assignment 1? There was a question this morning about the pop-up window. So when you run PyBullet, it opens its own window. The question was, can you control the size and position of it? The answer is maybe. It depends on your operating system. So your operating system is responsible for all windows that pop up and appear on your desktop and how they're positioned and how they're sized and so on. So if you want to see if you can grab control of it, Google, automated opening of windows or pop-up windows and the name of your operating system, and you may be able to figure it out. It's not a big deal for this course. We're going to be using the visualization front end on this physics engine for the next few weeks. But once you start to get into your evolutionary algorithm is going to start searching over dozens, hundreds, thousands, and depending on your laptop, possibly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of different robots. You're not going to be visualizing one of those million robots after another. You can run PyBullet headless, meaning it does not open this window and it does not do the graphics. It still does all the physics, just doesn't do the graphics. And as you can imagine, that allows things to go much, much faster. So the visualization is mostly for you and for debugging. Obviously, you're screen capturing some of your simulation and sending it to us for assessment. But as the weeks go on, you're going to be using it less and less. So you don't need to worry about it too much. But if you do want to try and figure out how to control it, give it a go. If you figure it out for your platform, let me know, and I will incorporate that into the Reddit instructions. Okay, obviously all of the assignments that you're going to be tackling are linked down there. So we're on sensors this week, motors next week. You're free to run ahead if you want, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, enter at your own risk. I am also running ahead of you and working out some of the kinks in the instructions from last year. If anyone has moved on to motors yet, there's an error in the motors assignment, and I have fixed it by updating step 7. So if you've got to step 7 and got tripped up in motors, or you're having problems with motors, go back and have a look at step 7, and hopefully that resolves any issues. For those of you that are running ahead, and if you see any issues, please let me know. That's obviously a helpful intel, and I will try and comb out all of those problems before the rest of you arrive at that assignment. Okay, all good? Any other questions about the assignments before we push on? No? Okay. Okay, so we are talking about neural networks. We were talking about neural networks. And we started in familiar territory with Bratenberg vehicles, 2 sensors, 2 motors, and 2 wires. We now know that those wires are synapses connecting sensor neurons to motor neurons. So at the beginning of our discussion last time, we threw away the Bratenberg vehicle. This is a sin against Cartesian dualism, but for the purposes of learning about neural networks, we'll look the other way this week. We looked at assigning weights to synapses, weight meaning the weight of influence. Weights can be negative or positive. Negative weights means that the presynaptic neuron inhibits the value of the postsynaptic neuron. Positive values mean that that neuron excites the postsynaptic neuron. In your head, there are a lot of inhibitory synapses and excitatory synapses as well. Okay, we looked at activation functions. So once we've computed the weighted sum at a postsynaptic neuron, once we've tallied up all of the influences from all of the presynaptic neurons that connect to that postsynaptic neuron, if that value falls outside of some desired range that we're trying to keep the neurons at, we can apply an activation function to squash it back to that desired range. There's lots of different reasons why we want to do that. In this course, remember that the values arriving at the output layer, these are going to be values that we're sending to the motors to try and cause some action to happen. Those numbers could be interpreted as newtons, as absolute force that the motors are trying to apply to the joints. In the assignments here, the value is going to be interpreted as a desired angle. So if we're connecting 2 links together and we have a joint in between, we assume that there is a motor attached to that joint, and that motor is going to get a number from a particular output neuron, and that motor is going to interpret that number as a desired angle that the motor should try and rotate the joint to achieve. Yeah? Okay. So obviously there's only so many angles that are possible. There's only so much force that a motor can apply. We're going to use those physical constraints to set the range of our output values and apply an activation function to keep values of those neurons inside that range. We looked last time at what neural networks do, not necessarily what they are. What they do is compute a function from values arriving at the input layer into the output layer. We looked at trying to build neural networks to embody the OR function, the AND function, and the XOR function. And we saw in the case of the XOR function, we needed hidden neurons, which are sandwiched between the input and output layer, to compute subfunctions. And then those subfunctions are combined by synapses and neurons into more complex functions at the output layer. Hopefully you got a sense of how difficult this is, which is why the bulk of AI research is focused on how to automatically find weights and activation functions and neural architecture. We ended by talking about neural architecture last time, and what I wanted you to take away from our hypothetical example here of the hospital is that if you set the neural network to be too big, too many neurons and too many synapses, the neural network will often do what all of us do the night before a test, which is panic and memorize the information that we have at hand, rather than trying to compress down all the information we have to discover underlying patterns. If a neural network memorizes the symptoms and disease outcomes of N patients, that's a really bad thing, because if patient N plus 1 comes into the ER and we plug that new patient's symptoms into the neural network, it's going to predict incorrectly whether it thinks they have the disease or not. So making the neural network too big is no good. And as we saw in the case when we were trying to build the XOR function, making a neural network too small, not having enough neurons and synapses, makes it impossible for the neural network to learn whatever function it should be learning. So we've got a bit of a Goldilocks problem. We want to create a neural network that's not too big and not too small for a given problem. You might come across this when you start to evolve your robot. Depending on what you're trying to evolve your robot to do, what's the right size of the neural network controller that robot needs? If you come and ask Krishna or I in office hours what the right size is, the answer we're going to give you back is, we don't know. It's an open problem about how to determine the appropriate size of a neural network and then learn the weights and activation functions for that neural network. It's known as architecture search, searching for the right neural architecture. If anybody comes up with a good solution to this problem, Google and Facebook and Microsoft would love to hear from you. Okay. Last detail of neural networks that's going to be relevant for our course are recurrent connections. At the moment, we've been looking at synapses that point somehow from the input layer down towards the output layer. You can have recurrent connections, and I've put a few simple ones in here that connect the two motor neurons together. You can also have recurrent connections that sort of go backwards, that go from the output layer to the hidden layer and back towards the input layer. What do recurrent connections do? They provide memory. So in this very simple example here, again, we have two sensor neurons and two motor neurons. Imagine at time step t, the values that we compute at each of the motor neurons are 1 and 1. At the next time step, at t plus 1, you'll see in the top right, the values of the sensors have changed. We take those values, we multiply them by the synaptic weights. Those values flow down to the motor layer. And at this snapshot in time on the right, we are computing the new value of motor 1. And remember, to compute the value of a postsynaptic neuron, we visit all of its presynaptic neurons, take those values, and multiply it by the weight of the synapse that connects that presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. In this cartoon example here, we see that there are two presynaptic neurons, which are the two sensor neurons, but there is a third presynaptic neuron, which is motor 2. So the new value of motor 1 is the weighted sum of the current values of the two sensor values and the old value of the motor neuron. So whatever motor 1 does at time step t1, it's going to be a function of what the robot currently senses and what it remembers motor 2 did at the previous time step. Yeah? We talked about Turing machines at the beginning of the semester that read something off a tape. In this case, your robot is reading off information from the world, combining that input with internal state. Neural networks do that using recurrent connections. It influences what it does at the next time step. This is a very important thing for performing actions in the real world, because just because you get certain sensory stimulation now doesn't necessarily mean that if you see the same sensory stimulation later, that you should do the same thing. You might remember something from the past that reminds you that you should do something different at this new point in time. Yeah? Okay. Recurrent connections add in memory. I don't have it on the cartoon here, but again, you can imagine some arrows that point from the motor layer back towards the hidden layer and back to the input layer. In mammalian nervous tissue, most of the synaptic connections are actually going in the opposite direction. They're going from your spinal cord and your motor system into the brain, and they're pointing towards the sensor parts of your brain. This is a very confusing and non-intuitive thing. Thinking about thinking is misleading. We're all taking in information through our eyes and our nose and our skin at the moment, and it seems obvious that we're hoovering up all of that information. It's flowing into the brain, into the sensory parts of our brain, cerebral cortex, and then out to the spinal cord and out to your fingers and toes and so on, right? It would make sense that most of the synapses are connecting the sensory part to the muscle part or motor part of your nervous system. Turns out that's not the case. Most of the synapses are flowing in the opposite or upstream direction. Neuroscientists have some ideas about why that might be the case, but again, it's an open problem. Interesting to think about. Okay, last thing I wanted to say about memory is let's go back to backpropagation of error, which we talked about briefly last time. In this cartoon example now, we still have these two recurrent connections between the two motor neurons. And we're assuming that if we get as input 0, 1, we want the two output neurons to produce 1, 0. We can see at this point in time that this particular neural network is making a mistake. It's supposed to be outputting 1, 0, and it's outputting 1, 1 instead. So the error is with the right-hand motor neuron 2, or output neuron 2. Remember, with backpropagation of error, we need to walk backwards through the forward synapses. We need to walk backwards and correct those weights, because it's the weights of those synapses that are flowing into the erroneous neuron, output neuron 2, that's causing the problem. So in this case, if you look at the bottom right neuron, there are 3 incoming arrows. So we need to walk backwards along those 3 arrows. And if we're not at the input layer, we have to keep walking, because maybe it wasn't those 3 synapses that were the problem, but the synapses that fed into the neurons, which fed into those original 3 synapses. So if you follow those 3 arrows entering the bottom right neuron, you're going to arrive at input 1 and input 2, but you're also going to arrive at output 1, the neuron at the bottom left. And the neuron at the bottom left has 3 incoming synapses. So if we propagate error backwards, I painted in red all of the synapses that have to be altered in order to fix the original problem that was originating at output 2. And you can see we've got a problem. Once you start to add recurrent connections, it's very difficult to localize where the error is. Oh, thank you. There we go. There's the red arrows. Okay. So everything got implicated in this case with the original problem that was localized at output 2. So backpropagation of error usually works because it's like applying a set of tweezers to gently fix a few parts of a broken machine. That works well if there are no recurrent connections. If you add recurrent connections, it becomes like trying to use a sledgehammer to fix a partly broken machine. You're hitting everything, and often you don't necessarily reduce error at the problem, you increase the error everywhere else. So things get a little bit tricky with backpropagation when we get to recurrent connections. For the purposes of this course, the most important thing to remember is recurrence gives the robot memory. Okay. So just to place evolutionary robotics in the larger landscape of AI and robotics, you may have heard about supervised, semi-supervised, and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is the easiest thing. That's what we saw when we were creating a neural network that computes OR and 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 XOR. Things are easier in the supervised case because we're supervised. We're told exactly, or the neural network is told exactly where the problem is. So at row 2, output 3 was wrong, but the other outputs were correct. When we move into robotics and using neural networks to control robots, we've entered semi-supervised learning. We take a neural network, we drop it into your virtual robot, it runs around, and imagine the fitness function is move as fast as possible. We drop a random neural network into your robot, and PyBullet tells us that that robot traveled 6.3 meters over 1,000 time steps in the simulator. Is 6.3 fast or slow? I don't know. It gives us a little bit of information because if we make a change to some part of the neural network and drop that altered neural network back into the robot, and that robot moves a little bit faster than 6.3 meters, then we improve the neural network. If the robot travels a little bit slower, then we made things worse, right? So we're getting a little bit of supervision back. We're getting global information back. How did the neural network as a whole do, rather than which part of the neural network was wrong and which part of the neural network was correct? Okay. Again, there's much, much more we could say about neural networks. That's all we're going to need for our purposes in this course. Any questions about neural networks before we move on to evolutionary algorithms? All good? Okay. Okay, so how do we actually tune the synaptic weights or the activation functions in a neural network to get our robot to move faster or jump higher or move towards round objects and away from edged objects? In this course, we're going to use evolutionary algorithms. Evolutionary algorithms are a very, very old set of algorithms, and arguably the very first computer program that was ever written towards the end of the Second World War was actually a form of an evolutionary algorithm. I'm not going to talk about that in this course, but basically goes all the way back to the beginning of computers. Why? Because if you look at nature, you can view Darwinian selection, Darwinian evolution, as a kind of algorithm. At any given point in time, there is a population of conspecifics, animals that are organisms that belong to the same species. Those organisms have different phenotypes. So phenotype means the shape of the organism, how it's built, and what it does. So what it looks like and what it does, that's the phenotype. The phenotype, if we plug those organisms into their environment, allows some of them to survive long enough to produce offspring, and others, unfortunately, not. The ones that do produce offspring, the offspring have phenotypes that are similar to but not identical to the parents. We repeat that process for dozens of years, hundreds of years, millennia, eons, and we get evolution. So in the very, very early days of computers, before there were pop-ups, there we go, this was boiled down to a very simple computer program. It's got different names. So evolutionary algorithms or evolutionary computation is kind of the umbrella term for a lot of different kinds of evolutionary algorithms. And in lecture 5, we're going to look at some of these different evolutionary algorithms. There are thousands of variations at this point now in the literature. We're just going to look at some of the major classes of evolutionary algorithms. The oldest one is probably the genetic algorithm, where we created a population of random vectors to start, as you see in the bottom left. The vector is meant to represent DNA somehow. Each vector encodes a bunch of numbers, which is a candidate solution to your given problem. So we define some problem, and we define the space of solutions where each given solution in that space of solutions is encoded in a vector. And we have a population at the beginning of random vectors. We assume we don't have a good guess about an answer to the problem, so create some random solutions. Take each vector, which is our digital genotype or digital DNA, and turn it into the phenotype, turn it into the actual solution, get the computer or the genetic algorithm to score that solution. So we now have a score or number associated with each vector in this population. We take half of the vectors that have the lowest values, delete those vectors, and make randomly modified copies of the surviving vectors until we fill the population back up again. So in that very basic description of a genetic algorithm, you can hear a lot of nouns and verbs, which are obviously stolen from evolutionary biology. When we make a randomly modified copy of a solution, like you see in the bottom right, we can take a surviving vector and copy it. And as we copy the values into that new vector, every once in a while, we can make a slight mistake to the copying process. That's mutation. We can also pick two surviving vectors at random and take the first k values from parent 1 and the last set of values from parent 2 and combine those two pieces together, and we have sexual recombination. We're trying to combine parts of candidate solutions into a new solution. Okay. What could some of these vectors represent? If we're evolving neural networks, what are the numbers? What could the numbers in that vector represent? The weights, right? So we could go back to the XOR problem. You could make a neural network architecture, and instead of sitting down and trying to dream up weights and activation thresholds, we could collect however many we need into a vector and start running a genetic algorithm on that neural network. The more that neural network reproduces the output of the XOR function, the more likely it is to survive and produce new vectors that are similar to but not identical to itself, right? Pretty straightforward process. Most evolutionary algorithms, you can write them in a dozen lines of code. If you're a good coder, you can get away with 6 lines of code. My master's thesis advisor, he could do it in 3 lines. It's pretty simple most of the time. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a series of evolutionary algorithms, but there's a cost to simplicity. The relatively simple genetic algorithm that I just described to you here, what's the cost? What's the limitation here?
Not a huge amount of variation with so many small or so little values.
Okay, so maybe there's not enough variation here. What are some other issues here? Yes? It's going to take a long time, right? So if we're dealing with vectors of floating point values, for all intents and purposes, there are an infinite number of vectors we can choose. What sorts of guarantees do we have that this evolutionary process is going to move through the space of all possible floats of length, vectors with floats of length n, to find a good one or the best one? The answer is we cannot provide such a guarantee, any more than Mother Nature can guarantee that a given species is going to survive another 10 years, another 100 years, another million years, right? Evolution is not an optimizer. Evolution is a satisficer. And we're going to see that over and over again in this course. We cannot guarantee that evolution will find the optimal solution, but it often comes up with ingenious solutions that are good enough, that satisfy whatever we want the robots to do or whatever the organisms have to do. Okay, so evolutionary robotics, the field was born in the early 1990s when someone figured out how to, oh gosh, this is going to be tricky. When somebody connected a genetic algorithm with some early simulators and started to evolve robots in simulation. I would love to play these videos for you, but now I'm thinking about how to actually make this happen. Give me 1 second here. Let's see what we can do. That's not going to work. Okay, I apologize. I will not be able to play these videos. I think I will be able to play the other videos for you. I will have to explain what's going on, and then you can come and watch the video lecture later today. What you would have seen in the video in the left, and I think you can kind of see the picture a little bit. This is a robot that has 2 vertical arms, and it's holding on to a beam. And hanging underneath the robot are 2 bricks, and those bricks are simulated batteries that are pretty heavy. This robot was evolved to do brachiation, which is to move hand over hand along a beam. Gibbons and other primates are very good at brachiation, swinging from tree branch to tree branch. This particular primate species that's here today, we're not very good at it. You can train and get a little bit better. It's a tricky thing to do. It's very energetically costly if you've ever tried to do this at the gym. The trick to brachiation is to exploit the fact that you are a complete agent. You have weight, you have momentum, you have inertia. So if you get on YouTube and you Google Gibbons brachiation and watch them do this, they are masters of throwing their weight forward in space to exactly the point where their center of mass should be when they grasp the next tree branch. They make it look effortless, and for them, it is more or less effortless. Okay. So in the video here, this is an older project where we evolved neural network controllers for these robots to brachiate. And then in this case, we had some talented engineers on the team. And in the right-hand video, which you'll have to watch in the video lecture, this robot we actually were able to instantiate this into a physical robot. And you can see, it's a little difficult to see, but in the bottom right of the bottom right panel there's a heavy battery. And the physical robot is also able to exploit its momentum to brachiate. So in evolutionary robotics, we're applying an evolutionary algorithm where the problem is trying to create a machine to brachiate or do something useful. And candidate solutions are different kinds of robots that are better or worse at performing this task. Okay. As we continue our discussion about evolutionary algorithms, we're going to introduce an important intuition pump. This is sort of a thought experiment. It's been around since the 1930s. It was actually proposed by Sewell Wright, a very famous evolutionary biologist. Fitness landscapes are a good way to think about what natural evolution is doing, or in our case, what evolutionary algorithms do. What is a fitness landscape? Well, let's start with a really, really simple situation. Let's imagine we have an evolutionary algorithm, and instead of a vector of n numbers, let's assume we have a vector with just one number in it. We have some digital DNA, we have a single number. If you remember back when we were talking about the Bradenberg vehicles, the first Bradenberg vehicle that we saw had one sensor, one synapse, and one motor, right? So imagine we're trying to tune the weight of a single synapse in a neural network. Probably overly simplistic for anything in the real world, but just imagine we were doing so. We can imagine the fitness landscape that's associated with that particular problem as follows. We create one horizontal axis, which is going to represent every possible value of that single gene in that digital DNA, which for our purposes is going to be the single value for a single synapse. We take that single synapse value, we drop it into vehicle 1, and the computer measures how well vehicle 1 does at whatever we want it to do, and it's going to give us back a score or a fitness value for that neural network inside that vehicle. So we now have a single number associated with that single gene, and that fitness value we're going to plot on the vertical axis, which gives us this one-dimensional landscape. What do the hills represent in the landscape? Yep.
Different values that score better with whatever your fitness is.
Absolutely, right? So hills represent good values of the synapse, and valleys represent low fitness values or genomes that correspond to poor phenotypes. As I mentioned, we're going to use these terms genotype and phenotype as we go through the course. For our purposes, genotype, we're going to use that term for any way of storing genetic information. In nature, it's chromosomes. In evolutionary algorithms, the genotype may be a vector. In a moment, we're going to see other data structures that also encode genetic information. And the phenotype is, again, kind of an umbrella term. It's anything that's produced by the genotype, right? So phenotype is typically, in the case of organisms and robots, the body plan, the nervous system, what we look like and what we do, body and behavior. Okay. Imagine now in the bottom right, we move on to vehicles 2A and 2B. So now we've got two synapses. We need the evolutionary algorithm to discover two values for those two synapses. So we have digital DNA in which the vectors are length 2. So we have two genes. So we have all possible pairs of values for those genes. So for each of those two genes, we create two horizontal dimensions. And as we now move about horizontally in this three-dimensional landscape, as we move about horizontally, at every horizontal position, it corresponds to a particular pair of values for those two synapses. And as always, we add one more vector, the vertical vector, which corresponds to the fitness of the robot when it's embodied with those two synaptic weights. So far, so good? Okay. That produces, obviously, the two-dimensional landscape that you see here, which exists in three-dimensional space. And as always, hills and mountains represent good pairs of values, and valleys represent poor pairs of values. If you cast your mind back to the previous lecture on artificial neural networks, when we were trying to create a neural network that computes the XOR function, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 synapses. And we needed 1, 2, 3 activation thresholds. 6 plus 3 is 9. We needed 9 possible values. If we were searching over the space of all vectors of length 9, looking for sets of 9 values that, when added to the neural network, produce the XOR function, what does the fitness landscape for that look like? It's 10-dimensional, right? So I don't know about you. I can't picture it very well in my mind. Let's try. We have 9 horizontal, quote-unquote, horizontal dimensions. And as we move about in that 9-dimensional horizontal space, every point in that 9-dimensional horizontal space corresponds to a particular set of 9 floating point values. If we take those 9 floating point values and assign it to the neural network and compute how well it computes the XOR function, the value that comes back, how well it did, is the height. So we add our 10th dimension, the quote-unquote vertical dimension. And again, in 10-dimensional space, hills represent sets of 9 values that produce XOR when the neural network is labeled with them. Values represent neural networks that compute something very far from the XOR function. Fitness functions are really useful for reasoning about how evolutionary algorithms work. The tricky part about them is we're usually dealing with very high dimensional spaces. Any questions about fitness landscapes before we push on? So far, so good? Okay. Okay. We're going to now look at a series of evolutionary algorithms, starting with the simplest one, the hill climber, which is very, very simple. But again, as you're going to see, there's no free lunch. We can't get away with things for free. There's going to be a cost. So we're going to explore increasingly powerful evolutionary algorithms that overcome some of the limitations of the simpler ones. In this course, you're going to be coding up a very, very simple evolutionary algorithm. And towards week 9 and 10, you're going to get really frustrated because that evolutionary algorithm is not going to work very well. It's going to get stuck. You are free in weeks 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 to swap out the evolutionary algorithm that comes with the assignments and put in a more high-powered evolutionary algorithm. I mentioned the hill climber is probably the simplest. Arguably, random search or brute force search is even simpler. The hill climber is still pretty simple. In the hill climber, we have a population of size 1. We don't start with a population of random vectors. We start with just one random vector, which is shown in the top left here. In my cartoon example here, obviously it has multiple genes. So the fitness landscape associated with this is very high dimensional, which I don't know how to draw. So we're going to just assume that there's only one gene when we're thinking about the fitness landscape. So we take our cartoon genome on the left, which has random values, and that takes us to a random position on the horizontal plane of our fitness landscape. And let's imagine that position is at position P. We're going to call this vector P for parent. And we take those values, we drop it into a robot, we evaluate how well that robot does, it gives us back a fitness value, and we now know the height of that vector, which we can represent as a point in this two-dimensional image, right? Okay. In this particular picture here, you can see what the fitness landscape looks like, but in all practical applications, we do not know what the fitness landscape looks like, which is exactly why we're trying to use a search process. If you knew what the fitness landscape looks like, you would go exactly here. You would go to the optimal solution, right? So you can think of the hill climber as a climber that's trying to climb Mount Mansfield, but Mount Mansfield is covered in fog and the GPS is disabled on the climber's phone. They don't know which direction to head in to head uphill, let alone get to the top of Mount Mansfield. So what do you do if you're that climber? Take a random step in a random direction, and if you've decreased in altitude, go back to where you started. If your random step allowed you to increase in altitude a little bit, stay where you are and repeat that process. That's the hill climber, pretty straightforward. So at this point in our algorithm, we take vector P, we make a copy, and then we introduce a slight random change to one of the genes. We're mutating the child vector. We're taking a random step horizontally in the space of the fitness landscape. We now evaluate the fitness of that child genome, and in this cartoon example here on the right-hand side, you can see that we took a step in the wrong direction. C has lower fitness than P, so we throw away C, we go back to P, and we generate a new random vector C prime from P and repeat this process. Okay, what's the problem with the hill climber? Super, super simple. You can code this up in 5 or 4 lines.
I think that if it gets to a peak and it starts going down, it might just get like infinite, like step down and like back.
Absolutely. So if it just keeps walking, as you were mentioning, it's going to get trapped on this hill that it's stuck on. It doesn't know that there are other higher hills. All it knows is that at some point, every step it takes is a step down, not a step up. That's known in the literature as being trapped on a local optima. So if we look locally, so if we look a little bit to the, if we go to P and look a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right, that hill there is the optima. It's the highest value within a certain local region of the fitness landscape. But it is not, as we can see, because we have privileged information, it is not the global optima, which is the top of Mount Mansfield. In the entire fitness landscape, what is the single vector that has the greatest fitness value? Most evolutionary algorithms suffer from getting trapped in local optima, and no one has a way to solve this problem once and for all. It is one of the Nobel Prizes that is waiting to be won in AI and robotics. Okay. How do we do better?
Try a bunch of random ones and record what's better.
Absolutely. So the next evolutionary algorithm is the parallel hill climber. At the beginning of this algorithm, we're going to generate not just one random vector, but a bunch of random vectors in parallel. So we're going to have P1, P2 through Pn. We can locate each of those parent vectors horizontally in the fitness landscape. We compute the fitness for each of those random p vectors. We now know the heights of each of those p vectors. And in this little cartoon example here, p1 is doing a little bit better than p2. We're going to then take each of these parents, and each parent is going to be allowed to produce one child. So p1 produces c1, p2 produces c2, and so on. As you can see in our cartoon fitness landscape, p1 got unlucky, produced a child that has lower fitness than itself, and p2 got lucky. It produced a child, c2, which is more fit than itself. What do you think happens in the case of p1 and c1 at the next moment in this algorithm?
It goes back to P1.
Absolutely. So evolution is harsh. p1 kills off its own child and goes back to p1. What happens in the case of p2 and c2? C2 has higher fitness. Yep.
C2 is allowed to reproduce one.
C2 kills off its parent. It's tough in evolutionary algorithms. P2 is gone, C2 survives, and C2 becomes the new P2. So at the next generation in this algorithm, we have again a set of NP vectors. Some of these are parents that survived from the previous generation. Some of them are children that outperformed their parents. Yeah? If you now visualize these N parent-child pairs that are moving about at different places in the fitness landscape, what happens as we run this algorithm forward?
They'll probably all get stuck on local optima, but they'll get stuck in different places.
Okay, so we're still getting trapped on local optima with plural now, optima. In the cartoon example here, you can see the P1-C1 pair. They're going to get trapped on the rightmost hill. They are not going to get to the top of Mount Mansfield. And in the case of the leftmost pair, they're most likely going to get trapped on that left hill and never reach the global optima either. But at least we've made progress. We've added a little bit of algorithmic complexity, and we've made a little bit of progress. We're at least searching in parallel for good solutions at lots of different places in the landscape. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this is probably the most obvious advertisement for why we use evolutionary algorithms in general. We can run this algorithm for as long as we want, and at the end, we're going to get back not just one solution, we're going to get back a population of diverse solutions, which are not necessarily optimal, but they're pretty good. This is probably the biggest advantage for using evolutionary algorithms for real-world problems. Most of the time, whether we realize it or not, we're not necessarily looking for a single one good optimal solution. We're looking for a bunch of diverse good solutions. We're going to talk about the xenobots towards the end of this course. In the case of the xenobots, we got back from the supercomputer a set of 100 simulated xenobots, and they were all different. We didn't use a parallel hill climber, we used something else, but we still got a nice palette or range of diverse solutions. And our microsurgeon at Tufts went through all 100 and said, I can't build that one, I can't build that one, I can't build that one. He knocked out about 90 out of the 100 that he couldn't build. The remaining 5, he said, I could probably build those, but it's going to take me days and days. There isn't enough caffeine in the universe to keep me awake to build those 5. Those 5 out of the 100, I think I can build them. He built those 5, 3 failed. The remaining 2, Xenobot 99 and 100, worked, right? That's why you want diverse solutions. Most of the time in AI and robotics, we're bringing stuff from cyberspace some way or another into the real world. And what works in cyberspace doesn't always necessarily work here in the real world. Man and AI and robotics never enters the same river twice. It works in the simulated river. When you enter the real river, the real world doesn't necessarily work. What's the best guard against that issue? Bring back lots of diversity from cyberspace and see what works. Okay. Let's keep going. So again, I've sort of cooked this example here. I've come up with a cartoon fitness landscape where the two solutions here get stuck. We're now going to come to the genetic algorithm, which looks a lot like the parallel hill climber. It starts in the same way. We start with n random vectors. We evaluate each of those random vectors, p1 and p2. In this cartoon example, let's imagine they end up in the same place they did before. Let's assume that unbeknownst to us, the two genotypes for these two parents, the genotype of P1 actually got part of the solution right, but the other part wrong. And P2 got the other part of the problem wrong, or got the other part of the problem right, and the second part wrong. So they both are partial solutions to the problem. Actually, P2 is pretty low down in this picture. Let's imagine P1 and P2 are at kind of medium height. They got medium fitness values back from the simulator. They actually kind of solved part of the problem. Let's imagine those P1 and P2 survive into the next generation, and we cut both P1 and P2 in half at exactly the same point. We take the first half of P1 and we glue it onto the second half of P2, and that becomes C1. We take the second half of P1 and we take the first half of P2. We glue those two pieces together and that becomes C2. In this cartoon example, we're assuming that C1 actually inherited the best of both worlds from its two parents. Just by chance, we happened to cut the parents in the right place, and we brought the partial solution from P1 and another part of the puzzle from P2, which placed C1 at a different place in the fitness landscape. And now, again, we still don't know because the mountain is shrouded in fog, but C1 is higher than both of its parents. It's inherited the best of both worlds, and it's actually on its way to solving the problem. It has approximate solutions to, let's say, the two sub-solutions that make up the overall solution. Remember when we were looking at the neural network that's solving the XOR function? It had to compute the AND function and then the OR function and then combine them. Imagine we have two neural networks, P1 and P2. Network P1 actually computes AND, but fails to compute OR. P2 computes OR, but fails to compute AND. If we cut those two neural networks in half and brought the successful AND from P1 together with the successful OR from P2, even if C1 is not necessarily combining the AND and OR together in the right way, we're pretty close. We're on the slopes towards the peak of Mount Mansfield. Yeah? Question?
Does the genetic algorithm create like every possible way to split up or to combine like the two parents?
Great question, right? So how do we cut the parents, right? In our cartoon example here, let's keep it simple. Let's just cut everything in half. But that's not necessarily the right place to cut things. How do we know where to cut things? Like everything in evolutionary algorithms, we could just roll the dice. We could make it a random process. Every time we grab two parents, we're going to cut them at different positions and hope that that's a good cut point between the solutions. It's very, very hard to know how to do this in a non-random fashion, to know a priori where to cut them. It is another open problem in the field of evolutionary algorithms. In evolutionary biology, there's a lot of interest these days in epigenetics. Who's heard of epigenetics? As the name epigenetics implies, it's sort of everything above or beyond or in addition to the actual genetic code. One of the things that Mother Nature has discovered over evolutionary time is that she can take a yellow highlighter and highlight parts of the genome. It's called methylation. There's other ways to do this. But it seems that there are markers on the genome, and those markers tend to influence where DNA is cut during meiosis. It's possible that that methylation or that nature's highlighter is Mother Nature figuring out some way of knowing where to cut. No one's quite sure yet, but there's a lot of active investigation around this idea. So one of the other things that's fun about evolutionary algorithms and evolutionary robotics, often when we get stuck in our evolutionary algorithms, we can go back to the evolutionary biology literature to see if there's recent things that have been learned about how evolution really happens in the real world and bring those back into making even more high-powered evolutionary algorithms. Okay. Yeah, but genetic algorithm, still pretty simple, but getting a little bit more complicated. What's the problem with the genetic algorithm? If there were no problems with it, everyone in AI would be writing genetic algorithms. It has problems. One of them was already mentioned. How do we know where to cut?
Are we assuming this doesn't have mutation?
The question is, are we assuming it doesn't have mutation? On the cartoon here, we don't have mutation, but yes, genetic algorithms also include mutation. So sometimes we mutate, sometimes we sexually recombine, sometimes we do both.
I just feel like if you had two pretty competent neural networks doing this job, and you took half one and half of the other,
Yep.
odds are it wouldn't do any better. It would be worse.
That's a great point, right? So I gave you the example of the two XORs. If you cut two neural networks in half and glue them together, what's the chance that you're going to get C1 in reality? What's the chance that C1 is going to do better than both parents? Very low. I don't know. Let's find out. I got a Mac here. Who has a PC? We'll go rent a chainsaw. We'll cut my Mac in half. We'll cut your PC in half and glue them together. What's the probability we're going to get a machine that's better than the two original machines, right? You're laughing because it's so obvious that it's going to be worse. But nature does this all the time. She's been doing it for billions of years. She can cut the DNA from two parents, not in half, but in some way, and glue them together and at least get a child that's as good as the two parents, and in some cases, better. Really, really, really hard to do right. We don't know how to do this well yet in evolutionary algorithms. It's a big, big problem. We're actually going to talk about this later in the course. It's known as the competing conventions problem. Macs have a certain convention under the hood. PCs have a different convention under the hood. If you cut them in half and put them together, the two halves are not going to talk to one another very well. Same goes for neural networks. Same goes for robots. Same goes for xenobots. Same goes for pretty much anything you might want to try and automatically design using an evolutionary algorithm. What other problem exists here?
It's not truly random, right? You're using pseudo-random number generation, so
Okay.
I wonder if that has an effect.
Yeah, great point, right? So when you're using random numbers in a computer, they're never quite random. They're pseudo-random. So are they random enough? Most of the time, for most problems, pseudo-random is good enough. But yes, there are conditions where it's problematic. Yes?
So it seems like the most important genes might have to be in the middle because anything that ends would be more likely to get popped.
That's a great point, right? So there's actually some pretty involved statistics that goes into sexual recombination. Genes that are out towards the end, they're not recombined very often. Things towards the middle are getting mixed up more than others. That's another problem. I've cooked this example here by putting C1 on the slopes of Mount Mansfield itself. Let's imagine that C1 actually ended up on the right-hand hill, and it was up around the same height as C2, which is usually the case, right? It's not very likely that right out of the box, right out of the gate, the genetic algorithm is going to land on the slopes of the global optimum. If C1 and C2 both landed on the right-hand foothill, what's the problem?
It's going to get stuck in the local minimum.
It's going to get stuck. So sometimes we talk about local minimum. If lower is better, that's perfectly fine. In this course, we're going to talk about local optima. Things that are higher are better. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. So now C1 and C2 and P1 are trapped on the right-hand foothill, and only poor P2 is actually somewhere else. And P2 is pretty low, so it's probably going to be killed off. And now we have only solutions on the right-hand foothill. And no matter how we slice and dice those genotypes, The new genotypes are likely going to be on the right-hand foothill. We have lost diversity in the population. One of the other major problems with evolutionary algorithms, other than getting trapped on local optima, is that you lose diversity, or these are often two sides of the same coin. In order for an evolutionary algorithm to work well, in order for biological evolution to work well, a population needs to maintain genetic diversity over very, very long time scales. Not an easy thing to do. Okay. Let's have a look at trying to build a slightly more intelligent evolutionary algorithm, and this one is designed to try and avoid getting trapped on local optima. This is known as the evolution strategy. There's a picture of a single genotype on the left. The genotype is now not a vector, it's a 2 by n matrix, if you like. For every element in the upper vector, there is an associated number. There's a number associated with it. Those numbers are step sizes, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay. Let's look at the fitness landscape. Let's look at the fitness landscape on the top right. In this case, we have a single solution that is actually on the slope of Mount Mansfield. It's looking pretty good. When we produce children from that single parent that's sitting on the slopes of Mount Mansfield, we can ask the question of how much do we mutate the child? Do we change one number? Do we change two numbers? Do we change k numbers? The more we mutate a child relative to its parent, the more horizontally distant that child is going to be from its parent. Remember that if we look at the horizontal dimensions in the fitness landscape, that represents, any point in horizontal space represents a given genotype. If we take two genotypes and we compute their horizontal distance, that represents usually the Euclidean distance between those two solutions, as long as those solutions are encoded as vectors. Generally speaking, the further apart they are in horizontal space, the more genetically distinct or diverse they are. How do we know how much to move something? We can often define it with a step size. So it's sort of the absolute distance we can travel away from the parent. So in the cartoon in the right, imagine we're drawing a circle in horizontal space where the circle is centered at P, and a child could be created anywhere inside the circumference of that circle. In the cartoon example here, where we have just a one-dimensional fitness landscape, if the radius of that circle is 0.1, the step size is 0.1, then the child could be created anywhere up to 0.1 to the left of that point, or anywhere 0.1 to the right of that point. So far, so good? I'm assuming we came up with this number beforehand, 0.1, right? 0.1 in this cartoon example is pretty good, because if this parent produces any children within this radius, half of them are going to be better than the parent, right? So 0.1 is actually a pretty good step size for this fitness landscape. Imagine instead that the fitness landscape actually looks like the bottom right picture. It's still the same problem. We just have a single gene and we have fitness on the horizontal value here. But now, any slight step you take, any mutation, any small mutation you make away from your current position, you're likely to move a big distance up or down. So if we now assume a step size of 0.1 again in this bottom right case, you can convince yourself from this picture that the vast majority of the children are going to be worse than the parent. So a step size of 0.1 is a bad choice for this particular genome in this particular fitness landscape. So how do we choose the step size? Any ideas? Seems hard to come up with a step size a priori. If we just set 0.1, it might work well for certain landscapes. But remember that all these fitness landscapes are shrouded in cloud. We can't see them before we start. So how do we set the step size? How do we know?
And the most optimal would be
half the size of your thinnest peak,
Okay?
but of course you can't really know that.
Exactly, right? So you can actually derive what it should be given your local landscape. It should be, the radius should be, yes, half of your peak or something to do with the local slope, but you usually don't know that, so.
You could start with a really small value, or just have a really small value, because then even if you have really small peaks, you'd still be moving up.
Okay, so let's start our basically genetic algorithm with a step size of 0.00001. We're going to pick a really small step size and run the genetic algorithm with that small step size. What's going to happen? I'm going to send you out on this cold day to climb Mount Mansfield, but you're only allowed to take a step of 1 millimeter at a time. It's going to take forever. So if you start with a really small step size, good. You're going to be able to climb local slopes, but do so really, really, really slowly. So let's throw away that idea. Let's start with huge step sizes, step size of 10. Let's run your genetic algorithm with a step size of 10. Now what happens? We're going to send you to the bottom of Mount Mansfield, which is shrouded in fog, and I'm going to give you a teleportation device. You can set coordinates to move 1 millimeter in a random direction or 1 mile in a random direction. What's going to happen?
Eventually, like, you'll miss the peak, you'll go over and down the other side.
Absolutely, right? You're going to start punching numbers into your teleporter, and you're going to jump huge distances horizontally. Sometimes you'll be high, sometimes you'll be low. What's the chance you're going to hit? You're going to hit the peak or near the peak? Even if you land almost on the peak of Mount Mansfield and you put in a new number to your teleporter, you're gone, right? So too small isn't good. Too big isn't good. What might we do that's slightly more intelligent?
You could scale it according to how well or bad your species is.
Absolutely. We're going to try and adapt the step size. If things are moving too slowly, we're going to increase step size. If things are going too quickly, we're going to reduce it. But how do we know the rate at which we should turn that knob?
It could be inversely proportional to the score. Like, if you're scoring really badly, you can do more drastic changes.
That's a great point. So if you're at low values, you want to jump further. And if you have high fitness values, you're going to jump a smaller amount. That's actually known as simulated annealing, which is simulated annealing is a very old optimization process in computer science. You could argue it's a form of evolutionary algorithm. It does just that. It's one way of doing things. In the evolution strategy, it also adapts step size, but it adapts it by evolving the step size. So the genome on the left, we have our synaptic weights in the vector itself, and each element in the vector has its own step size. So imagine this particular genome survives. It's a parent, and it produces a child. So we're going to walk from the left to the right along this genome and copy these values from left to right. And as we do, at each one, we're going to introduce some random noise. And the amount of random noise is going to be dictated by the step size associated with that value. So when we copy the value of 0.3 into the child genome and add noise, the new value could be anywhere between 0.2 and 0.4, because the step size is 0.1. When we copy the value 0.4, the new value in the child could be anywhere between 0.2 and 0.6. Genome 2, we're actually varying more, gene 2, we're actually varying more than gene 1. Take that intuition and transfer it to the fitness landscape. What does that mean about the way points are moving horizontally in space? Forget the fitness for a moment. We're just talking about mutation. Mutation produces children that are at some distance horizontally away from the parent. If different genes have different step sizes, what does that mean? What's happening?
Those genes are
Not necessarily worth less. Yep.
Genes that have lower step sizes are at maybe local optima, maybe.
Possibly. So we're obviously, so for example, in this cartoon example for gene 1, whatever that horizontal direction is, we're moving a smaller horizontal distance away from the parent. Gene 2, which is the second horizontal dimension, we're moving a greater distance. So we're not just jumping around randomly relative to the parent, we're moving horizontally further or shorter distances along different dimensions. Now, why we're doing that, that's not clear at the moment. We're still at the beginning of our evolution strategy. We've set the initial values for the synapses, if that's the problem we're trying to solve, in the upper vector. In the lower vector, again, we don't know what step sizes we should set, so we're setting those step sizes at random. Imagine now we have a population of these 2 by n matrices. So each parent produces children that are offset horizontally different distances from itself. Some of these parents are going to produce fitter children than others, and they survive, and those children produce children of their own. Some parents don't do very well. They don't produce good children, and they're eventually replaced by these other parent-child pairs. In the more successful parent-child pairs, what is it about the step sizes that's allowing them to do a better job compared to the less successful parent-child pairs? It has something to do with the values in the upper vector, obviously. It's better at encoding and, an or, an XOR. What is it about the step sizes that's helping the more successful families compared to the less successful families?
The 2 step sizes are very different, then you're going to take, they move different amounts, and it'll allow you to cover either things that are like an optima that's very close to where you are in the fitness landscape, and one that's very far away from where you are.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned in this example, we assume that the distances that are being traveled, children are produced horizontally a long distance along this horizontal dimension and a short distance along this dimension. That wide and shallow jumps that are being made, that successful family happens to be sitting on a very broad and shallow mountain, right? So it's climbing. Those particular combinations of step sizes are appropriate for the local landscape, right? As we saw in the cartoon examples in the upper right there, different step sizes are appropriate for different local topography. We don't know what that's going to be at any given time. As this successful family is moving along in possibly rugged foothills. So a successful family has, just by chance, small step sizes, which allow it to move through very rough terrain. But as it's moving slowly through this rough terrain, it hits on, unbeknownst to that family, a shallow gradient, which is leading up towards the peak of Mount Mansfield. It's no longer going to survive unless the descendants of that family have larger step sizes, right? How can that possibly happen, given what I've told you so far about the evolution strategy? So this is the last piece of an evolution strategy.
Well, once you hit those relatively like less gradients of down or up on your peak, maybe you can increase your step size from there.
You can increase your step size from there, but it's not us that's increasing the step size because the mountain is still shrouded in fog. We don't know. It's advantageous if the step size were to increase. How might it increase in the evolution strategy? The values in the vector, the upper vector, are being changed by mutation and possibly sexual recombination. We're searching for the set of 9 values that produces the XOR function. What about the step sizes underneath, associated with those values?
They could maybe be updated by comparing like the difference after a generation.
Okay, so we could try and set them based on what happened in the recent past. There are strategies that do that. In the simple evolution strategy, we're just going to mutate and sexually recombine the step sizes as well. If a mutation produces a bigger step size among a family of solutions that's on the bottom of a shallow slope leading up towards the peak of Mount Mansfield, that family is going to do well. So we're mutating the DNA itself, and we're also mutating the way in which the DNA is changing. Make sense? I'll leave that for you to digest. We have a quiz due tonight. You're working on assignment 3. I'll see you back here Thursday morning. Have a good rest of your day.